So this week we're going to be looking at an introduction to JavaScript, which is having some understanding of this is going to serve us well in looking at some of the other things that we'll be doing in the upcoming weeks. And what I expect will end up happening is that you'll probably not end up writing a great amount of JavaScript yourself, but you'll possibly end up using a lot of third-party JavaScript, things like if you want to use Google Maps, that uses JavaScript, and a lot of Yahoo Pipes, we can do stuff with that with JavaScript. So some basic level of understanding of at least how to read it really goes a long way to enabling you to be able to use third-party JavaScript implementations. So JavaScript is a client-side scripting language, and I say that as opposed to a server-side scripting language. So the difference between those two things are a server-side scripting language, something like PHP, that exists, the program that interprets and executes the PHP code lives on the web server, and all of that processing is done on the web server, and then it usually just returns simple HTML to your web browser, and then that's just rendered and interpreted as normal HTML. JavaScript, on the other hand, is actually downloaded as code from the web server and then run in the browser itself, so the browser being called the client. So that's why we call it a client-side language, and that allows it, because it's running in the browser itself, it allows it to be really quick at certain things. So it's really good for doing things like interacting with the web page and responding to user input, things like that. So basically, the two main really powerful things that JavaScript allows us to do is, first of all, manipulating a web page, and that can cover a multitude of things. So hiding elements, showing elements, adding elements to the page, applying styles, taking styles away, manipulating the core structure of the web page in any way that you could do yourself if you were typing it in code, really. And then the other thing that is really powerful that JavaScript allows us to do is respond to events. And when we say events, we usually mean user input. So we can respond to mouse clicks, we can respond to keyboard events, things like this. So JavaScript is, I would say, probably the most widely implemented, the widely used, most widely written language in the world. And I really think in this day and age of web design and web development, it's really a requirement to have some level of JavaScript understanding along with your HTML and CSS, even if you never intend to be a hardcore developer, because it's rare you work on a project of any substance that won't involve JavaScript of some sort, even if you're not writing it yourself. If ever you've downloaded Lightbox or some sort of image slider, guaranteed that uses JavaScript in some way. So as I say here, there's tons and tons of really great resources for learning and documenting JavaScript on the web. So I haven't written a whole lot of notes here. I'm not going to bother trying to recreate those because the stuff that already exists is really, really excellent. What I want to do today rather is do a demonstration of firstly some of the fundamental syntax of the JavaScript language, and then some of the common things that you will use it for. And then I'll point you to some other external resources for sort of expanding on the stuff that I'm going to show you today. So I'll jump straight into the demonstration now, and I've got a list of the things that I'm going to go through, and they'll become more clear what I'm talking about as I go through them. As usual, obviously I can't teach you the entire scope of JavaScript in one lesson or even one semester, and I wouldn't expect anyone to even bother doing that. The way that I think you should approach it is get some level of understanding of the fundamentals, and then basically research the parts of JavaScript that you need as they apply to whatever problems that you're going to be solving, whether that's this assignment or any other project in the future. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of background detail about necessarily why I'm doing a lot of things, but if there's at any point where you want me to clarify something I'm doing or why I'm doing it, then just yell out and I'll be happy to either answer it straight away or refer you to something else that might answer the question for you. Okay, so I'm starting with a sort of a skeleton HTML page here. I've just got a simple HTML5 page, and I've just got a heading and a paragraph, just so that we can see something on the page. And I've started this from a pared down installation of the HTML5 boilerplate, really just so that I can use normalize.css if I want it. Other than that, there's nothing in that folder yet. I've got some images here later to show you how to do some stuff with images if we get time for that. And otherwise, just a plain HTML file that looks like this. Okay, so the first thing we need to know is how we actually include the JavaScript in our web page. And that is very similar to the way that we include other external resources like
Google Fonts.
Yes, like Google Fonts. Exactly, that's exactly how you include Google Fonts. But also things like CSS. There's a special tag for including scripts, and it just looks like this. Okay, so the script tag, and my editor here by default is adding the attribute type equals text/JavaScript. In HTML5, that's actually optional. If you don't add that there, the specification says assume that anything inside there is JavaScript, because it could be something else. But so that doesn't really matter. I'll leave it there because my editor is adding it by default. That's fine. So anything you put between these script tags, the web browser will interpret as JavaScript and try and execute those lines of code. So the first thing that you do generally in any programming language is you do a program called, or you create a program that essentially just outputs hello world so that you know that it's working. So the way we're going to do this in JavaScript is type in alert, and then inside of these parentheses or roundy brackets, we type in a text string here inside of quotes and whatever we want it to say. Okay, so this is a very simple one-line command in JavaScript, and what this does is it outputs a dialog to the browser window with the text that you specified inside those parentheses there. So if I refresh my page now, okay, so this is the alert. So anytime you call that alert function, what you put in there is going to be output like this. Okay, and then you hit OK to dismiss it. Now, what I want you to notice here is that where I actually put these script tags within the HTML actually matters. So if I refresh this page again, you'll notice that the alert is being output before any of the content on the page is loaded. And that's because I put my script tags up here in the head section, which is perfectly legitimate. There's nothing wrong with putting them there, but the JavaScript will be executed in the order that you put it in the page. So if I put it before any of the body content is specified, then that's going to happen before then. So if I grab this and put it down after my heading 1 and my paragraph has been specified there and put it there, what you'll notice now, if I refresh, is that the content of the page will actually load first, and then the JavaScript will be executed there. Okay, so the first point is the whereabouts you put your JavaScript inside the HTML file actually matters. It will just go through and sequentially it will do whatever HTML is there and then whatever JavaScript it gets to. Now this becomes particularly important when you end up doing things like manipulating the content of the web page itself, because you might put a script up the top here somewhere which says grab this H1 and change the text or apply a style to it or something like that. Now if it hasn't loaded in the page yet, that's not going to do anything. And JavaScript can be described as a very forgiving language. If you do something that's an error, usually it won't fail. It will just try to do that, and if it doesn't work, it will skip it and move on. And that may sound like a good thing, but in reality it can be a bad thing as well, because it makes it harder to figure out when something is actually going wrong. But usually if something's not working when you're trying to access something on the page, it's because the elements on the page haven't loaded before you've tried to access them with the JavaScript. So basically, for a couple of reasons. So as I said, you can really put the script tags anywhere in the document you want. If you do need, for whatever reason, your script tags to load before your content, then it's normal to put those in the head tag. And if you're doing anything like loading fonts through Google Web Fonts, or if you're loading any APIs like Google Maps, you will see them suggest that you put it in the head section, because they do actually need to be loaded for whatever reason before the content of your page is loaded. But anything else, unless you need that by convention, it's generally considered best practice to include your scripts as the very last thing within your body section. So all of the HTML, and then finally the script tags at the bottom here. Now actually having them here doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to be executed after everything's loaded, because you may, for example, because when the web page is loading, sure, it loads all of the HTML, but you may have other external resources that are loading as well. So something like an image. So an image, especially if it's large, might take a while to download. So even if you have the script tag here and the image tag itself is loaded, but you try and manipulate the image before it's fully loaded down into the browser, then that will fail to work as well. So there are ways to ensure that that we don't run any JavaScript until the page and all the elements on the page are fully loaded, and I will show you how to deal with that later. But the other reason that we put that unless we need the scripts to load before the content of the page, the reason that we put them down here is because, especially if it's a large script, it's beneficial to have the content of the page visible while those scripts are loading after that, rather than having a blank screen while the JavaScripts load. So it doesn't matter a huge amount in terms of execution in the end, but you'll see by convention, basically your script's placed in one or two places: in the head section if they're needed before the content loads, or just before the closing body tag if they're not. And so that's the convention that I'm going to follow. Now, just like you can have inline CSS and external CSS, you can have inline JavaScript and external JavaScript. So what I've done here is inline JavaScript. I can have a bunch of script tags throughout my HTML code here. All right, so I'm going to put another alert here and go only the heading should be loaded here. Okay, so I've got two script tags now, one with an alert, and as I said, it's going to execute sequentially top to bottom. So by the time this one executes, the heading 1 should be loaded, but the paragraph will not be. And then by the time the second one comes around, all of it should be loaded. Okay, and so we can see that. It gets to the heading, then it executes the first piece of JavaScript. I click OK to dismiss it. It goes on and loads the paragraph, and then gets to the next bit of JavaScript, which loads up another alert. And as sort of an anti pop-up feature, browsers will usually give you the option to prevent multiple pop-ups from happening like this. That's just what that's happening there for.
You can hide and stylize all that later.
This dialog here That's usually dependent on the browser styling, actually. But what you'll find is actually alerts. Alerts probably should only really be used for quite serious feedback. There's a serious error or something. Usually, what's preferable if you want to give other feedback is actually to inject some sort of message into the page itself. So if you've ever seen when you've got form validation stuff and it will come up with like red text underneath the form which says, oh, this has to be formatted as an email address, something like that. Yeah. So that's actually the last time I'm going to use an alert there because an alert is good for seeing that a particular bit of JavaScript is accessible, but and for outputting values, but it gets annoying because they show up and you have to dismiss them and then we'll keep executing and go to the next one. So what is actually preferable for just outputting information is using something called console.log. Okay, and so I can put a text string in here inside of inverted commas, and I can say hello from the console. Now the console, what is the console? Well, every modern browser that you have is going to have some form of developer tools. With Firefox, very popular tool is Firebug, and you'll probably be familiar maybe with the HTML inspector, which shows you all the elements, but you'll also notice this tab over here called console, and this outputs, you can output directly to this. It will also show you errors that pop up. You can even type in commands of JavaScript down here by yourself, so I can trigger an alert like this here simply by typing it in there. Okay, and other browsers are going to have similar things. Okay, Chrome's development tools also has a console, okay, which does essentially the same thing, as will Safari, as will Internet Explorer, as will Opera. Okay, they all have it. Okay, but just for demonstration today, I'm just going to use the Firebug one, just because I kind of like it. Okay, so as you can see, if I reload this now, what it's doing is rather than putting up an annoying alert, which I have to dismiss, it's just simply outputting here. And I can ignore that if I don't want. It doesn't interrupt the flow of interaction with the page, but it's just nice for outputting debugging information. If I have anywhere throughout my code where I need to output the value of something, then using the console is really useful. It will output it and it will tell me the exact line of the file that it's come from, so I can go back and cross-reference that with line 19 and go, okay, that's where that's output from. Okay, so that's what I'll mainly be using, and of course this is really just useful for you as a developer. The end user's never really going to see that unless they bother opening up the console and having a look there. Okay, all right, so I was talking about the difference between inline and external JavaScript files. So my suggestion and best practice, for the same reason that it's good to separate your CSS styles in an external file, because it makes managing the files easier and it separates your style and your structure. For the same reason, it's a good idea. Also, the ability to reuse across multiple files. For the same reason, it's good to put your JavaScript in an external file. So that's what I'm going to do here. I've got a JS folder for keeping any number of JavaScript files in there that I want. I don't have to. I could put them in the root directory, but just to keep things nice and tidy, I'm going to put them inside of here. So I'm going to create a new file. Call it whatever you want. I'll just call this script. And the file extension is .js, JavaScript. And what I do is what I do is I simply type my JavaScript commands in here. I don't have to add the script tags. The script tags are only necessary when I'm embedding the inline styles, so that the browser knows when I'm differentiating between HTML and JavaScript. And so I'll keep that there for now, so you can see that there's nothing wrong with combining inline and external JavaScripts. But the way that we include external JavaScript file is again very similar to including an external CSS file. We use the same script tag. All we do is add a src attribute which points to the JavaScript file that we want to include. And so in this case it's in a folder called JS, and then the file is called script.js. Okay, so this can either be relative to your current file, or it can be an absolute path, or it can even be a URL to a JavaScript file that lives on another server. And you'll see that very commonly if you're using any third-party JavaScript. If you're including, again, web fonts or like the Google Maps API, instead of downloading their JavaScript files to your web server, you can actually just link directly to them from someone else's. So you'd have a URL here that looks like http:// and then some web address, and then ending in a JavaScript file. So, okay, so it's really flexible that way. And then our script tag is just empty there. So what this does is it goes and looks for this file and then just grabs whatever JavaScript is in there and then pretends like it's inside of these script tags. Okay, so again, the order of this is going to matter. If I put this before the inline script, then all of the JavaScript inside of here is going to execute first. If I put it after, it's going to execute second. Okay, so I'll jump over to my JavaScript file here, and I'll do another console.log, and I'll say hello from the console. Sorry. It's hello from an external JavaScript file. And then this one could be hello from an inline JavaScript block.
JavaScript files usually have a CSS file as well, or is that?
Sorry, what was that?
Do JavaScript files have a styling sheet as well?
No, the CSS files still just apply to your HTML files. So you'd link to the CSS file the same way you would normally, but what you can do with JavaScript is, say, apply a style, and if it's in an HTML page that is linked to that CSS file, then it will know how to find that CSS style. Yeah.
I've used JavaScript stuff before that had a style sheet with it, but that should have been.
What that could possibly have been is because JavaScript, you can essentially inject anything into the web page you want. So it's perfectly reasonable that you could inject a link to a CSS file in the header using JavaScript rather than typing out there itself. So that's probably what it's doing, yeah. Okay. All right, so we'll run this. And we get, noticing the order of execution, hello from the inline JavaScript block, because it comes first. And then we get the external script, hello from an external JavaScript file. Okay. So now that I've done that, I'm going to pretty much write all of my JavaScript in this external file and not worry too much about inline scripts anymore. Okay, now the next thing I want to show you is and the other thing is when I said that JavaScript's a forgiving language, it's actually forgiven me an error here that I've made. Every statement in JavaScript should end with a semicolon, and I didn't do that there, and I should have. And even though JavaScript will attempt to figure out that that's what I meant, you should really make sure that you end each statement with a semicolon. Because in JavaScript, it really actually doesn't matter if you write things on multiple lines or everything on the one line. Statements are always separated by the semicolon. The spacing of things doesn't actually make any difference except for readability for you as the reader and the writer of the code. So the next thing we'll look at is comments. every programming language has something called comments, which are simply, again, they're not statements that are executed by the JavaScript, but they're purely for your own benefit for documenting your code. So the way that we do that, there's two ways, and this is pretty standard in lots of languages. The first way is a single line comment. Okay, so if I wanted to remind myself what this bit of code does here, I could say output text to the browser console. Okay, now it's not actually going to do anything. JavaScript's going to ignore that line. It's purely there for me to write myself a note to remember what something does, usually. Okay, so as I said, there's two ways of doing it. There's a single line comment, which is you just start the line with a double // and then there's a multi-line comment, which looks like, so if you have a bunch of lines, okay, a comment over multiple lines, you've got two options there. You could either start each line with a double / like that, or you could wrap the whole thing in this, so you could wrap the whole thing in these characters here. So / asterisk, and then the opposite of that, the n asterisk /. Then anything between those two things will be considered a comment. So this is useful for two things, as I said, documenting your code for your own benefit and for other people's benefit who may come and work with your code. And then the other useful thing that this is for is temporarily disabling a line of code. So you may want to disable a line of code but not delete it entirely, so you don't have to rewrite it again if you want to enable it. So often you'll see me if I want to keep a line of code there but I want it to become inactive, I'll just add a comment to the front of the line or to a block of code so that the browser ignores it. So you'll see if I run this now, it won't output anything because everything in that, including this statement here, is being commented out. Okay, so all right, so now let's look at something called variables. So variables, again, is something that's common to every programming language. And what we use variables for are essentially remembering bits of information that we may want to use later on. And the way that we tell JavaScript that we want to remember or we want to create a variable is we use this keyword var, okay, short for variable, and then we give it a name. Okay, so this can be pretty much anything you want, but there's some rules for naming your variables. So the first rule is it has to be one word, so you can't have spaces in the variable name. So if I want to create a variable to store a number and I want to call it my number, okay, that's not a legitimate variable name. It's not allowed to contain any spaces. The second rule is that it can be made up of only alphanumeric characters and the underscore character. So that means letters are legitimate, numbers are legitimate, and the underscore character is also legitimate. So I could call this my underscore number 1, for example. And the third rule, and the only other rule is, well, sorry, no, there will be a fourth rule. The third rule is that it has to start with a letter. So my number 1 is legitimate, but 1, my number, is not legitimate. Okay, and finally, the fourth rule is you can call it pretty much anything you want except something that's called a reserved word. Okay, so for example, var here is a reserved word. JavaScript has reserved that specifically to recognize that you're declaring a variable. So I couldn't, for example, call my variable var because it will think that I'm attempting to declare two variables there, and that will call an error. So you can find a list of reserved words. It's unlikely that you'll accidentally run into them. but if you do, it will show you an error. But other than that, you can pretty much go nuts with calling your variables whatever you want. It is useful to give them a name that actually means something. So in a lot of generic examples, when people are teaching, you'll see them say something like my number, which doesn't actually mean anything, but in this example I haven't told you what I want to use this number for. So for just this example, I'll use the very undescriptive name my number. Now, the final thing I'll tell you about naming variables, and this is not a rule, but it's generally a convention, just for readability. If you have a variable name that's made up of multiple words, because we can't use a space, in place of a space, you'll see one of two things. People will either do my underscore number, or actually some people might combine it all together like this, but that's not particularly readable. So one thing that people will do instead of a space is use an underscore, my underscore number. And the other thing, which is probably actually the more common convention in JavaScript, is to use what's called camel casing. And camel casing means the first word starts with a lowercase letter, and every subsequent word starts with a capital letter. So that's why you'll see me write things like that. And as I said, it's not necessarily a requirement, but it's a convention, and it makes your code a little bit more easily readable. Okay, now the other thing to remember about variable names and function names and names in general, and anything that you write in JavaScript, is that JavaScript is a case-sensitive language. So there is a difference between my number with a capital N and my number with a lowercase n. Those two things are not equivalent. If I create a variable with my number with a capital N and then later try and access it by my number with a lowercase n, it won't know what I'm talking about. Okay, so that's a really common error that comes up when you're starting out with JavaScript, is you'll forget about the case sensitivity. So if you think that you've named things the same and they don't appear to be working, that's one of the first things to check that they are exactly the same in terms of the casing. Okay, so that's all I'll say on variable namings. Once we've said that we want to create a variable, usually we want to assign a value to it. And we do that using the equal sign, and then we give it the value that we want. So if I want my number to be 10, that's how I do that. And then I end the statement with a semicolon. Okay, and then I can create other numbers. So let's say I want to create two numbers here. I'll have my number 1 and I'll have my number 2, and we'll make that 1.5. So now I've got two numbers here, and so now that I've got these pieces of information stored, I can do a bunch of things with them. One of the most common things to do is perform mathematical calculations on them. So I can, for example, do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and you do that pretty much exactly how you would think. So I can, for example, output to the console with console.log, and then previously I've just specified a text string inside of here, but you can also put the result of a equation in here. So I could say console.log my number 1 plus my number 2. Okay, and so that's going to look for my variable called my number 1 and get that value 10, and then add it to the value of my number 2. Okay, so when I load that in here, I can see the result there makes sense, 11.5, okay, 10 plus 1.5. And while I'm here, okay, I might as well show you the other operators. So we've got addition, subtraction, division, multiplication, and one here which you'll probably rarely see or use, but this covers all of the mathematical operators. This one here is called the modulo operator, and what that actually does is gives you the remainder of dividing this number by this number. So we'll see the result here. Okay, so there's the first one, addition. So 10 plus 1.5 is 11.5. Subtraction, division. Okay, so 1.5 goes into 10, 6 and 2/3 times. What have we got here? Multiplication. So 10 by 1.5 is 15. And then the modulo operator here has given us a result of 1. So what it's done is gone number 1, so 10 divided by number 2, 1.5, which we did up here, is equal to 6 and a bit. So it goes into 6. So 1.5 goes into 10 6 times to give you 9, and then the remainder is 1. Okay, so that's the modulo operator. So that can be useful for doing things like, let's say you want every fifth item of a set of things. Then you could do a test which says if the current index modulo of the whole thing is 5, then you know you've got every 5th index of something. But that's kind of by the by. You won't come across that all that much. Okay, let's see. So I'll comment this block out because they're kind of generic things. They don't mean anything. When you're creating something useful, as I said, you'll probably have good reason, or it'll probably be obvious what you're going to name things. So let's say I have a application in which I need to represent a user or a person. So let's say I need to represent myself. Let's say I want to represent my name, my first name, my last name, my height, and my weight. Then I need 4 separate variables to store those things. So it makes sense to call my first variable name. Or if I want to store them separately, first name, set that equal to. Okay, and so this here, what I'm doing, you have what's called different types of variables. Okay, so these first variable types we declared up here were numbers. You've got another variable type called a string, which is essentially just a bit of text. Okay, so if you want to declare a string, then you simply put it either inside of double quotes, or you can also use single quotes. Okay, so either is acceptable, and you may find yourself mixing them up. The reason that that's handy that you can use either or is, let's say I have a string called Dave's class. Okay, if I attempted to wrap this in single quotes, you'll notice that it's actually, this is going to cause an error because it's assuming that apostrophe here is actually closing that first string, and then you've just got some random characters out here that aren't going to do anything. So what I can do is use double quotes to surround the string, and then the single quote will be left alone inside of there. Okay, but all I want this to hold is my first name. All right, and then I can create another variable called last name. And I'll put my last name in there. And then I can create a variable for my height. And I'll put 1.84. And I'm going to write a comment here, and you'll notice that I can put this at the end of the line. It doesn't have to be on its own line, which is just a comment that I'm going to remind myself that this is height in meters. Okay, and then I'll create another variable called weight equal to 82, and then another comment where I'll just say that's in kilograms. Okay, so what I've got now is a bunch of variables here. So what I can do is, I can perform calculations and generate information based upon these variables. So, but before we do that, maybe let's just output something simple. I'll show you something else first. Okay, so I'll do another console.log, Okay, and previously up here I've output the result of numbers, or I've output just a string that I've entered in here directly by myself. So what I'm going to do here now is show you how you can actually combine, you can combine multiple types of information in a in a console log output. So what I can do here is I can actually output my first name, last name, my height, and my weight all in one go. And the way that I do that is I just reference that variable. Okay, and then what I can do is I can join two strings together by using the plus sign. It's called concatenation. So I can say first name plus last name. Okay, and I'll just try that to start off with. Okay, and you can see its output here. Now, slightly annoyingly, it doesn't have a space between my first and last name, but that's quite easy to fix. I can simply just keep concatenating strings together, and I can simply put in my own string here, which has a blank space. So now it will join first name with a space with my last name. Okay, and then I can continue that along. So I can say, whoops, what there? So first name plus last name is plus height plus meters tall and plus weight plus kilograms heavy. Okay, so what I end up getting here is this all gets joined into one big long string. And what's interesting is that up here, when we were just adding two numbers together, okay, we got the numerical, we got the mathematical operator of those two. If ever you have numbers involved with strings, then the string concatenation is going to take precedence there, because it doesn't make sense to mathematically add a number to a bit of text. So what it's going to do is convert your number into a bit of text there and then output it like that. Okay, so there we get the output there. So I get my name is, and then my height tall, and my weight heavy. Okay, so now what I want to do is calculate something called my BMI, or my body mass index. Okay, which if you've never heard of that, is a number based on your height and weight, which gives you some idea of whether you have a healthy weight range or not. Okay, and the calculation to calculate your BMI is to take your weight and then divide that by the square of your height in meters. So what I'm going to do down here is create a new variable called BMI, and I'm going to set that equal to my height variable, and then divide that by my weight variable multiplied by itself. Okay, so something multiplied by itself is the same as squaring it. Alright, and then I can do another console.log and say BMI is plus, and then my variable BMI. Okay. Then I'll go back here. Oh dear, what have I done? Sorry, I did it the wrong way around. It should be my weight divided by my height squared. Alright, let's try that again. There we go, that makes more sense. Okay, so it's telling me my BMI is 24.22 and some other decimal numbers there. Okay, so what I can do now is basically a BMI has a bunch of ranges. If you've got a BMI between 20 and 25, you're considered to have a healthy weight for your height. If it's over 25, then it's considered that you may be unhealthily overweight. And if you're under 20, it may be considered that you're unhealthily underweight. So what I can do now is I can have it output and tell me whether I'm overweight, underweight, or whether I have a healthy weight. So the way that I need to do that is I need to output a different thing based on different conditions. And so the way we do that is to use something called conditional statements. So far, everything we've done is just executed one after the other in order from top to bottom. But what I want to have now is I want something to output if a certain condition is the case, and then something to output if a different condition is the case. So the way that we do that is we use something called the if statement, and it looks like this. If, and then rounded brackets like this, and then opening and closing curly braces. So what goes inside of here is essentially a condition that we test for. So if whatever we put in here evaluates to be true, then whatever is inside the curly brackets will be executed, and if it's not true, then it will just skip that and move on. So I can say something like if BMI is greater or okay. So we've got a bunch of operators here. So I've got a number here, and I can test whether it's certain values. So I can test whether it's equal to a value, in which way I use the double equal sign. Now the reason I do the double equal sign here, and this is another common mistake to forget to use double equals, is because the single equal sign is already reserved for assigning a value to a variable here. So if you want to test for equality, it's always the double equal sign. So I can say if BMI is equal to 25, okay, in this case I want to actually test if it's greater than. So I can say if BMI is greater than 25 using the greater than sign. I can say if BMI is less than 25 by using the less than sign. I can say if BMI does not equal, okay, so that's how we say not equal with an exclamation mark and an equal sign. And then I can also use greater than or equal to or less than or equal to. Okay, so these are all called comparison operators. Okay, and if you look at any of the documentation links that I've given you, you will list them, or you can find them by an easy Google search. So if you don't remember these by heart, don't worry. Soon enough you use them frequently enough that they just become second nature. So what I actually want to say here is if BMI is greater than 25, then console.log you may be overweight. Okay, so let's see what happens here. Alright, so I've refreshed the page and it hasn't output anything differently. And that makes sense because as we can see here, my BMI is 24.2. Okay, so I'm not quite at that. I'm not quite over 25. But let's just say I have a nice big bender and I put on 10 kilos. Okay, and all of a sudden I'm 92 kilos. Now, alright, we'll look and see what I refresh. Okay, now my BMI is 27. So when it gets to this conditional statement here, it goes, is BMI 27 point something greater than 25? Yes, it is. That evaluates to true, so I'm going to do what is ever inside of these curly braces here. And then it outputs, I may be overweight. Okay, so now I actually have three different conditions that I want to test for. I want to test for if it's overweight, I want to test for if it's underweight, and I want to test for if it's healthy weight range. Okay, so this is already my test for overweight. Now I can add another test to the end of this by going else if. Okay, and inside here I'll say else if BMI is less than 20, then I may be underweight. And that should be up there. Okay. So let's say I'm now 62 kilos. Okay, so now my BMI is 18. That's certainly under 20, and so that is BMI less than 20 evaluates to true. Yes, it does. So it executes. So this one, obviously it does this one first. The BMI was not greater than 25, so it's going to ignore that. Then it's going to test this one. That evaluates to true. Okay, so it does that one. And then finally we can do another one to test the in between those two. So I can say else if, now in this case I want to test if the BMI is less than or equal to 20 and also greater than or equal to, less than or equal to 25 and also greater than or equal to 20. So I can actually chain these conditions together. So I can say if BMI is less than or equal to 25, okay, then I'm not overweight. And so the way that we say a logical and is to use two ampersand signs like that. And we could say and if BMI is greater than or equal to 20, then console.log, you have a healthy weight for your height. Okay, so there's only ever really two things you'll put here. You'll either put an AND operator here, which means that both of these must evaluate to true for the whole thing to be true. Or if I wanted to, I could have an OR operator, which is two of these pipe characters, which is usually shift and then the backslash key. So this whole expression will evaluate to true if either of those two evaluates to true. Okay, but in this case, I need both of them to be true. So I'm going to use the double AND there. Okay, so now if I put my weight back to 82, it should. Okay, my BMI calculates as 24 point something again, and then, okay, in that conditional statement, it's determined that my weight is less than or equal to 25 and greater than or equal to 20. Okay. All right, so now, okay, so that's conditional statements. So I'm going to comment out a bunch of this stuff again. Yes.
For the last one, could you just else?
Sorry, what was that?
For the last one, could you just use else?
Yes, you're absolutely right there. So, very good point. This actually would operate exactly the same if I just wrote else here. So what you can do, and you'll always see this as the last one in a set of conditional statements, is basically else operates if none of these other ones is evaluated to true. Okay, and because if my number is less than or equal to 25 and greater than or equal to 20, or if my BMI is not greater than 25 and it's not less than 20, then there's no possibility for it to have any other number than between 20 and 25. So you're absolutely right. I could have written this as just else. If these two statements fail, then I'm going to assume that there's no other possible value for my BMI than something between those numbers. So that would work exactly the same way as well. And in fact, if I was writing this, that's the way I'd write it because it's more efficient. The only reason I wrote it the other way was to show the AND and the OR operators. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's comment comment a bunch of this stuff out. And I'll get rid of that. I don't really care about that anymore. Okay, so I'm not outputting anything anymore, but I've still got a bunch of variables. Now, let's just say, for sake of argument, I want to know what my BMI equates to at a bunch of different weight ranges. Let's say I want to know what my BMI is going to be if my weight is anywhere between like 60 and 100 kilograms. And as you can imagine, that might take a bunch of lines of code. So what I would end up needing to do is resetting the value of weight here, or even just recalculating the BMI. So saying BMI equals, so instead of using what's saved for my weight, I'll use the number 60 divided by the square of my height, and then saying console.log BMI, okay, and then repeating that with 61, and then 62, and then 63, all the way to 100. As you can see, that's going to take a lot of lines of code and is going to be very tedious. So fortunately, we don't have to do that because we have other things called loop structures. And what a loop structure allows us to do is essentially run multiple lines of code over and over again. So the way that I would do this is I would, well, first of all, I'll create a loop structure. So a loop structure looks a little bit similar to a conditional statement. And there's a few different ways of writing loops. The first one I'll show you is called a while loop. Okay, and what this does is, again, we put a condition in here. And as long as this condition continues to evaluate true, then it will process whatever statements I have inside of the curly braces. Okay, so I could do something like if first name is equal to Dave, then console.log first name. Okay, this is nonsense. There's no reason I need to do this. But the reason I say this is if you do something like this, what you'll get is called an infinite loop. Because this first name is never changing, this is always going to evaluate to true. So if I was to run this, it would just actually keep looping over that and performing this statement forever and ever and ever. My browser would actually hang, and I'd have to close it down and restart it. So that's not something that I want to do. So what I do want to do here is essentially I need to create a variable here, and this is a temporary variable which is going to represent a theoretical weight here. And this is the one time where you'll commonly see variables that don't necessarily mean much. So when you're creating variables in a loop, it's quite common just to see them written as I or X or count, okay, something generic like that. So I'm just going to do something like this, and I'm going to say var I is equal to 60, and I'm going to say while I is less than or equal to 100, then BMI equals so I'll copy and paste that. BMI equals I divided by the square of my height, and then I'll console.log BMI. And I'll say BMI for weight plus I plus kg. Okay, now if I was to run this, this is still actually going to be an infinite loop because there's nowhere where I'm actually changing the value of I. So what I need to do is each time I go through the loop, I need to increase the value of I by 1. So I can do that by saying I equals I plus 1. Okay, but you will more commonly see this written in the shorthand of I++. Okay, so that's the increment operator. If you have a variable number and you put a plus after it, it will just add 1 to the value of it. Similarly, you can use minus and it will subtract 1 from the value. Okay, so this is commonly what you'll see this loop written as. Okay, so I've declared my variable 60. Each time through I add 1 to it, and so this is going to continue evaluate to true until the value of I gets up to 101, and each time through it's going to recalculate the BMI using this value of I for the weight, and then outputting that calculated BMI to the console. So we'll try that, and as you can see very quickly, it's output 40 or 41. I guess, lines of output to the console with the BMI that I would have at my current height at these theoretical weights. Okay, so we've avoided having to write these 2 lines of code 41 times in order to do that. Okay, so that's the value of having loop statements. And we'll actually use that heavily next week when we're pulling the data in from our Yahoo Pipes example, because what it will come in is essentially a list of data, and there's no way for us of knowing how many there are, so we can create a loop structure to go basically loop over all of the elements of this until you've exhausted all of the elements. Okay, now, so that's one style of loop called the while loop. More commonly, you will actually see something similar called a for loop, which essentially just combines all of this logic, the declaring of the variable, the conditional statement, and the changing of the variable into the one line. So let's comment that out. So I can change this while loop into a for loop, which is actually much more common and what you'll see me use in future when I'm doing any kind of looping stuff. And all I do is I change while to for, and I put these 3 statements inside here. So first of all, I declare a variable, then I have the conditional statement, and then finally that's separated by, and these, again, as I said before, it's not line returns that separate statements, it's semicolons. So these are all 3 separate statements here. So all I'm doing is combining the declaring of the variable, what I do with the variable after the loop, and then the conditional statement into one line. So the only reason I showed you the while loop first is because I think it's a bit easier to understand than initially looking at the for loop like this. Okay, but this should do exactly the same thing. Okay, and that's much more commonly the way that you'll see loops written, just because it's a bit more compact. It's a bit more compact, requires less lines of code, and it's easier not to forget to include this changing of the variable there. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to show you is, again, this is something which allows us to be a bit more efficient and avoid writing unnecessary lines of code. What you've seen is I've written these 2 lines of code. A few times now, and what we can do is we can, if you find yourself writing the same code over and over again, we can create essentially a block of code which we can call multiple times so that we don't have to go and write that out over and over again, and we call that a function. So what I can do is I can create a function which actually performs this BMI calculation for me without me having to write out those lines of code every time I want to do it. Now, where you put your function in JavaScript doesn't actually matter, but it's good practice. Just because other programming languages require it, and also it makes your code a bit easier to read, again, to declare your functions before you actually call them. So what you'll see me do is usually put the functions at the top of the JavaScript file. Now the way I declare a function is by using the keyword function. Okay, and then opening and closing roundy brackets, and then opening and closing braces. And sorry, I have to give this function a name. So again, function names have all the same rules as creating variable names, so you can call it whatever you want as long as it's alphanumeric, starts with a letter. So I can call this function calculate BMI. Okay, and then inside of here I would have these lines of code which calculate the BMI. Now, the way that I call this calculate BMI is essentially is to write the name of the function, okay, and then use the opening and closing round brackets, okay, and that will call the function, execute whatever code is inside of here, and then continue on. And you might notice that this looks familiar. This looks similar to when we say something like alert, or even console.log. Okay, and it is because it's exactly the same. These are both functions. It's just that this function here exists inside of an object called console. That's why it's console.log. Now, just as with the alert function and the log function, we can send bits of information, okay, like this. We can pass this bit of information along to the alert function so that it knows what we want it to output. In the same way, we can pass information along to our own functions. So in this case, the calculate BMI function is going to need to know 2 bits of information in order to do its calculation. It's going to need to know a height and a weight. So the way that we specify what bits of information to send is height and weight. Okay, we create actually variable names here, which are separated by commas. Okay, and the order that these are is important because when I send the information, it needs to be the height first and then the weight. So when I call the function down here, sorry, this should be calculate BMI, okay, then I send it a value for height, which in this case I want to use the variable height that I've already declared up here, and I want to send it a value for weight, which in this case is this value I from within the loop. Okay, and what that means now is that I can use these variables height and weight within this function here. Now, I have, as you can see out here, I've already declared these variables height and weight out here. So you might think that this is conflicting to have variables called height and weight inside of this function. But in fact, it isn't. There's a thing called variable scope, which means that inside of a function, if you declare variables here or even inside of here, then the only place they're going to exist is inside the function. So you can actually use the same function variable names inside of here as outside of here without having them conflict. So anything I've declared outside of here is known as a global variable. Anything I've declared inside of here is known as a local variable. Okay, so what that means is I can declare the variable BMI again inside of here, and it's not going to conflict with this BMI down here. So this here, I now need to refer to these variable names here for my calculation. So it's going to be the weight, whatever weight was passed into the function, and whatever height was passed into the function here. Okay, and then the console is going to output the calculated BMI. So now instead of writing those 2 lines of code here, I just have to write 1. So it doesn't seem like we saved a lot of code, but this function could have 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 lines of code in it. Okay, and so not uncommonly you'll have pretty big functions. So if you do that and you constantly run the same code over and over again, then this is a good way to just make it a bit easier for yourself, not to have to write so many. It's also good to get used to the structure of a function as well, because when you're using anyone else's JavaScript code, be it Google Maps or whatever, what you're going to be doing is calling their predefined functions.
Is it a good practice to then put that function in a separate function file?
You could if you want. I'd only maybe recommend that if you had a bunch of functions that you wanted to share between other files that you didn't have other JavaScript that was necessarily related to it. I doubt you will come across for a while an issue where either way it would make much of a difference. But if you did do that, what you would have to make sure you did was include the functions file also in your HTML file, because there's no actual way of linking just JavaScript files between each other. They all sort of just get included and then interpreted as one big long JavaScript in the HTML. Okay, so this should now do the same thing. There we go. The other thing I can do with a function is, let's say every time I called the function I didn't actually want to output to the console, but I just wanted to calculate the BMI but then use it later. What you can do is return a value from a function like this, okay, and then I can assign that to a value. So instead of doing this calculation here, okay, I can assign to this BMI variable here the return value of this function by simply setting it equal to the name of the function and then sending it my height and weight, like so. So in this way, if I do want to output it to the console, I could just do a console.log. Okay, and I can even include the full call into there. Okay, there it is. And sorry, actually there we go, that's what I want. Whoops.
So this one will be the console?
So far it is, yeah. So far it is.
Okay, so we will make it eventually so it can be viewed on
Yep.
the website by the public.
In fact, I'm going to get onto that right now. Yeah. All right, let's just break that down. Okay, that's enough. All right, so I will comment this out. So yes, you're absolutely right. So far, all we've done is output stuff to the console, and that's just because it's the simplest way to see stuff working. And by now, we've actually covered all of the basic language structures of JavaScript, and once you know them in one language, you pretty much know them all. So if you can digest basically what I've said over the last hour and 15 minutes, you probably consider yourself capable to start programming in almost any programming language, really. So it's amazing how few things you need to do any programming feat you can imagine. Okay, so let me just refer back to my notes here. Okay, there is one last thing that I will talk about actually before I move on, and that's just because it's going to be particularly relevant next week. There's one more variable type that we've got called an array. And an array is simply a list of multiple objects. So rather than storing one single value, you can store a list of things. So let's say up here, along with my information here, I want to store some of my interests. Okay, so I can do this in an array. And the way we define an array is using square brackets. And then we put a bunch of values in here. So I can say, well, I like tennis. Music, films, travel, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so a bunch of interest there. And what I can do is I can output any of those. And the way that I reference one individual element of this is by calling the interest variable and then using the rounded brackets. I put a number in here, and this number is going to represent the position in this array or this list that it is. Now, the important thing to know about this, and so this is what I'll refer to as the array index. Okay, so the important thing to remember about this is that in JavaScript and in a lot of programming languages, the indexing starts from 0. So the first element is not at index 1, the first element is at index 0. Second element is at index 1, the third is at index 2, and the fourth is at index 3. So if I want to output the first one, I output interest 0 like that. Okay, so if I get this wrong and I think that this is the fourth one and attempt to output index 4, okay, I get it outputs undefined, okay, because there is no index 4, that's index 3. Okay, so that's another common thing. That's another common thing that you'll come across is you'll forget that the indexing starts at 0 and ends at the array length, or 1 minus the length of the array. So what we normally do with arrays is output them in a for loop. Okay, and we do it using making a conditional statement that looks like this. Okay, so we start at 0 for the first index, and then we say keep going. Now I know there's 4 elements in this array. Okay, so I could say keep going until I is less than or equal to 3. Okay, but you're going to if I then later on add an element or take an element away from this, then that's not a good way of doing it. And next week we're going to get arrays that we have no way of knowing how many are in there. So the way that you always loop over an array is to say the name of the array, interests, okay, and then an array always has a property called length, okay, which tells you at that given time how many elements are in that array. So we want it to keep going until I is less than interest.length. Okay, now, so that's going to keep going. That's going to fail as soon as I equals 4, which I want it to do. I don't want it to go past I equals 3. I could always also say keep going until I is less than or equal to interest.length minus 1. Okay, I could do that as well. But this is the correct way to iterate over an array. And then we can do console.log interests. And then instead of specifying a number in here, we specify whatever the value of I happens to be. Okay? And then outputs like that. Okay, so now I'll move on to actually creating something in the page. So we are running a little short on time, so rather than creating these things from scratch, I'm going to just load up some pre-done something I prepared earlier. And let's see, where do I have that? Okay. So what I want to do now is look at what we call DOM manipulation. So DOM, D-O-M, stands for Document Object Model, and it's essentially just the way that the browser in memory represents the structure of the web page. Okay, so there's nothing really fancy about it. It's just a bunch of elements with attributes and text, stuff like that. Okay, so I've got this new web page here now where, okay, it looks like this. Um,
So what was it called again?
the document object model. Yeah. Okay, so I've got some new HTML in here, and basically what I've got now is some HTML which can output some of that information about the person, me, that I've been storing. So I'm also going to replace my script with this one I prepared earlier. Okay, and it does a bunch of things. Let's just ignore this image gallery for now, okay, and focus on this top part here. So what I've still got that's familiar from the last script is I've still got this calculate BMI function. Okay, I've still got that, and what I'm going to show you now is something which you can technically do in plain JavaScript, but I'm actually going to use a third-party JavaScript library to make this easier. So you may or may not have heard of something called Jquery. Jquery.com. Okay, it is essentially, you download it and it is a JavaScript file which you include in your project. And what it does is it solves two major problems. First of all, it solves a lot of cross-browser compatibility issues with interpreting JavaScript in different ways, which can be a problem. And it also gives us some really cool, powerful ways of selecting elements in the page and manipulating them. So while you can do all of this stuff in plain JavaScript, I never ever do it not with jQuery, and that's very common. It's very common to do it this way anyway. So if you're interested in seeing how to do it in plain JavaScript, then the resources that I've linked you to will go through that. But as I said, I've always do this stuff using jQuery anyway. So first of all, there is two ways to include jQuery. One, you download it from the website and you save it into your JavaScript file and you link to it like any other JavaScript file. The second way of doing it, which is actually the preferred way, is to link to it straight from a online resource. So there's a thing called there's things called CDNs, stands for Content Delivery Network. Don't need to remember that, but they're essentially web servers that exist all around the world which contain files to quickly serve them to you. And so Google has one in which they allow you to include, among other things, the jQuery library. And you can find that easily by just Googling something like Google jQuery CDN, okay? And it will take you to a page of different libraries that you can include. There's a link to jQuery, and it gives you the URL that you need to include in your source file for jQuery there. Okay, so as you can see, it ends in JavaScript. As I said before, there's really no difference between loading up a JavaScript file from your local web server or from an external one. Now, the important thing is that I've included the call to jQuery before my custom script because I need to reference jQuery from my custom script. I need to make sure it's loaded first. Now, the first thing that I'll draw your attention to is a jQuery feature. And jQuery, anytime you see these $ here, okay, that's just a shorthand way of accessing any jQuery function. So all jQuery is a bunch of functions that they've written, which you then call, just like you would call a function that you've created yourself. So this first bit here is the way that I talked about earlier, where just by ordering your scripts in a certain way doesn't guarantee that they're going to that all of the page resources are going to be loaded before you attempt to access them. And because now I'm doing things which are manipulating the web page, I want to ensure that I'm not executing this JavaScript code until I'm sure that all of the assets, images, and HTML on my web page have been fully loaded. So the way that we do that is like this, okay? And you'll find that on that'll be the first thing that they tell you on the documentation on the Jquery website, okay? And it just looks like this, $, round brackets, document.ready, okay? And then here you're actually declaring your own function, okay? So just like we declared a function before, we're declaring a function here with a block of code, and what you're saying is run this function when the document is fully loaded and ready to go. The only difference here is we haven't given this function a name, which is fine. You can do that. It's called an anonymous function. It doesn't have to have a name because we're not calling it from anywhere else. It's being called automatically by this document.ready function. Now, you can do this using plain JavaScript, using syntax that looks like this, window.onload equals function, same deal, okay, and then you put all your code in there. Okay, so you could do that. Sorry, it should be W. That's the way to do it in plain JavaScript. The reason I do it this way is there are benefits, which I won't necessarily go into the details of here. If you care enough, you can find the reasons for that. But generally, I will always use the jQuery's document.ready function. Okay, so all that does is ensure that this code inside of here doesn't get executed until the web page is fully loaded and everything in it is fully loaded. So again, I've declared all my variables here. And then the next thing I've done here, okay, this is again another bit of jQuery. You can tell because it starts with a $. You may also see this written as jQuery like this. Okay, so you can write it like that. The $sign is simply a shortcut so that we don't have to write as much text. So what this line does here is something called DOM selection. Okay, it selects elements in the web page. And again, there's ways of doing this in standard JavaScript, but jQuery does it in a much cooler way, a much nicer way. And so the format of this, the selector part is this here. So it's $. So this is actually calling a function. Okay, $, and then there's a string inside of here. And what you'll notice is that these all look like CSS selectors. Okay, and that's a feature of jQuery. So the way that you select things is by specifying CSS selectors. Now that could be an element name, so I could select all paragraphs by saying P. Okay, it could be a class name, so I could say .sum class. Okay, in this case, I'm looking for an element with an ID of name. And if I jump back to my HTML file, okay, I can see there's a heading there with the ID of name. Okay, so this now is going to select this element for me. Okay, the second part of this, okay, is I then chain another function together, and so this is another common thing of, this is essentially the way that jQuery works. You'll select something, and then you'll call a function to do something with it. And this text function, again, you'll find all the names of the function on the jQuery website, which I've linked on the blog post. This text function essentially puts whatever you specify in here inside of whatever node you've selected here. So I've selected this heading 2 with the ID of name, and the text that it's going to output here is going to be my first name variable up here with a space, and then the last name variable as well. Okay, so as I can see when I load this, okay, it's hard to tell because it's loading off the hard drive instantly, but when this does load, if I disable, let's see, okay, if I get rid of this script tag here, if I comment out, okay, so I've commented out the link to my custom script here, so none of the JavaScript will operate. Okay, this is what you'll see is output. It outputs only what I've specified in the HTML, which is mostly a bunch of empty tags here. Okay, so there's my heading 2 with the ID of name. It's still there, there's just nothing in it. Okay, so it only gets populated with text when it comes through here, the page loads, and then this bit of JavaScript selects that node and then outputs the text to it. Okay, similarly, I've done the exact same thing with the element with the ID of height, which is here, this paragraph. And now you possibly finally can understand why we're so insistent that you name things with IDs and classes the way we get you to do them. Why it's important that an ID is unique, so that we can select it in something like JavaScript and it refers to just that one element. Okay, so I've done the same thing for the height. So I'll do it again. So the height there gets populated with the height. And a bunch of the other stuff gets populated as well. Let's see. Okay, I'll come back to this. I'll come back to this weight input field in a moment, and I'll jump down to this interest field here, and let's have a look at what's going on there. So the interest in the HTML is simply it's a div with a container, and then there's a heading which has the interest, and then I've got an empty unordered list. So logically, what I want my JavaScript to do here is loop through this array of interests, and for each one that's there, I want to output a list item inside of that empty unordered list. Okay, so that is exactly what I'm doing here. So I've got a for loop which loops through all of the elements in my interests, and then I've got a Jquery selector which selects the element with the ID of interest, which is this unordered list. Okay, and then I call a function called append. So what append does is if I was to call text here, if there was already something existing in there, it would replace it. What append does is if there's something already in there, it just adds something on to the end. So if I was to call text here, each time it went through the loop, it would override it with the same list item. But by calling append, what it does is adds one after the other. And what I could actually do here is put an alert in that does nothing but simply just to pause the execution so that you can see that this does this in multiple steps. Let's see. And let me just comment that out. Okay, so you can see that first alert has triggered just after the first time it's gone through the loop. Okay, so it's added a list item there with the first array element. Next time it's added another one, next time it's added another one, next time it's added another one. Okay, and then that's it. It just happens so fast that it looks like it does it all at once. Now, the other thing I've added to this interest section, let me get rid of that alert. The other thing I've added to this interest section is you'll notice that I've made it respond to a mouse click so that I can sort of expand and contract it. It doesn't look very nice, but functionally it demonstrates a concept. So this involves a couple of things. The first thing it involves is responding to user input. So I've looked at manipulating the DOM. Okay, and now I'm looking at responding to user input. So this is the first instance of this. So what I'm obviously needing to do is saying something like, when I click on this, if it's closed, open it up and show this stuff down here. Or if it's open, when I click on it, hide that other stuff. Okay, so that's exactly what this block of code here is doing. And so the way that we respond to an event is, again, we select the element that we want to respond to the event, in this case the interest heading, and then we give it a type of event. And again, all these events are listed in the jQuery documentation. Probably the most common one you will use is a click event. So we say .click, and then we specify a function, okay, so just a block of code which should be executed each time that a click event is detected. So this is the code inside of our function, and inside of our function we need to have a conditional statement, because as I said, the behavior is going to be different based on whether the interests are already expanded or they're contracted. So what my conditional statement here is saying, well, if the interests, so the interests being the unordered list, if they're already visible, then hide them, okay, and change the text of the interest heading to be interest and then the plus sign. So you'll notice that this little plus sign here changes to a minus as just kind of a visual indicator of what the action is. So when I click it as a plus, it expands. When I click it as a minus, it contracts. Okay, and then finally, just to show you another feature of manipulating the DOM, I'm also, depending on whether I'm expanding or contracting, I'm either adding or removing a class here. Okay, and then the else is really just the opposite way around, and it does the reverse of everything. Okay, so otherwise, if it's not visible, then do essentially the opposite. What I'm really interested in here is this add class and this remove class function here. And so I've specified a class name here called simple border. And this kind of goes to a question earlier as to how it references the CSS classes. So in my HTML file, okay, I've linked to a bunch of CSS files, including this style.css here. Okay, and I've already created some styles, and one of them is a style for a class called simple border. So just by virtue of the fact that I've included these style sheet in the HTML page and the JavaScript has access to the HTML page, then it knows where to access this class if I define it here. So you can see that all I'm doing with this style here is adding a border and some padding. And so depending on whether I'm expanding or contracting it, it either gets added there or removed. Again, that's something you can do in plain JavaScript, but it's a lot easier and more powerful to do it with jQuery. Now, the only other thing I've done up here is I've hid the interest by default and set the interest heading by default because I wanted it to be contracted by default. That's all there. If I don't have these here, then it's going to start out as expanded. Okay, and I can still contract it, but just because I want it to start out contracted by default. Okay, all right, we're nearly at the end. So what I'll explain now is this here. So what I can do is I can type in any number I want here, and I can hit calculate BMI, okay, and it goes away and does something, and it outputs to the page what my body mass index is. You'll also notice that depending on what the value of this is, it's going to apply different classes. Green if I've got a healthy range, or red if I've got an unhealthy range. Okay, so how does this work? Well, first of all, we have, again, in our index.html file, I've got a bunch of that information at the top surrounded in an HTML form. So an HTML form doesn't necessarily have anything to do with JavaScript. You can submit a form without JavaScript at all, but I can interact with the form using JavaScript if I want. So let's see, the important things I'm interested in here are this text input with an ID of weight. Okay, so that's where I enter the number in then. And then I've got a submit button here. Okay, which I click. Okay, so I'll jump back over to my JavaScript file here. Sorry, my form, you'll notice, has an ID of user details. Okay, so there's a couple of ways I could do this. I could have responded directly to a click action on the submit button here, and that would be fine, but just to show you another way of doing it with a form as well, what I can do is react to the submission event for the form, for the entire form itself. So that's what I've done here. I've selected ID user details, which is my form, and then I'm responding to the submit event and declaring a function here. Now, the first thing you'll notice that is different is I've got a variable in here. And the first question you ask is, where the hell did this variable come from? Well, actually, anytime I have an event, a function that responds to an event, even this click one up here, okay, I can put an event in here as well. Okay, any function in response to an event will always be sent an event object by Jquery, and that contains information that's potentially useful about the event. The only reason I've left it out here is because I haven't used it. I don't need it. And you don't have to call it event. You can call it whatever you want. Okay, you might see it called E or EVT, or you could call it you could call it whatever you want. But it makes sense because it's an event object. Call it something like an event. So call it something like event. And now that I put that there, I can refer to this event object inside of my function. And I need to do it in this case because I need to do something called event.preventdefault. And what that means is a form has a default submission action. Okay, you'll notice if I comment out that bit of code there and I submit something, okay, it reloads the page. Okay, that's the default action of this form. So what I need to do in my JavaScript here is tell it not to do that. And I do that by using event.preventdefault. It's a little bit abstract, but that's just how you do it. So that's the first thing I need to do. Now, what I need to do is somehow extract the value, okay, from this text field here to use as my weight. And the way that I do that is I'm creating a variable called weight. Okay, and then I'm selecting the element with the ID of weight, which is this input here. Okay, and because it's a form input, the way that I get its value using Jquery is using this .val function. You'll notice that in Jquery, a lot of these functions are have the ability to both get a value and set a value. If you don't put anything in here, it gives you the value. If you do put something in there, then it sets the value. So in this case, it's getting me the value of that weight input. Now this little thing I'm doing here is simply just a bit of form validation. I'm checking that the person has actually entered in a number here. So the two things I'm checking here is basically this is checking if it's invalid input. And the two ways it's going to be invalid is if it's an empty string, so if weight is equal to an empty string, or I call this function called isNaN, and that stands for is not a number. So if I've entered text in there, okay, that's going to evaluate to true. If I've entered anything other than a number. And so what that does is if I've entered in something that's not a number, it's going to display an alert with that message there. So I can test that. Okay, if I type in, first of all, nothing, an empty string, okay, it pops up the alert. Also, if I type in some text, even if the text has some numbers in it, okay, that also fails. Okay, so that's just a little bit of form validation. So, if that doesn't evaluate to true, then I can assume that I have entered a number in that field. So I go to this part of the conditional statement else. Then what I do is I calculate my BMI using the height and the weight, which as we see up here. So the height I've got predefined up in my variables here. The weight, I'm ignoring this weight here. The weight that, where are we here? The weight that I'm referring to here is this weight that I've defined up here, which I extracted from the input field. Okay, and then I'm calling the calculate BMI function, which is still up here, which returns me a BMI, which is assigned to this variable here. Okay, and then all I simply do is, again, another selector, looking for the HTML element with the ID of BMI, which is simply this paragraph here, and then calling the text function and outputting body mass index BMI, and then the actual value that I've calculated. Okay, and then finally I have a conditional statement here, which is the same one, or very similar to the one I had before, but just worded slightly differently to figure out if it's either a healthy or unhealthy BMI. So if the BMI is greater than equal to 20 and is less than equal to 25, then I'm assuming I've got a healthy BMI, in which case that BMI paragraph, I'm adding a class called healthy BMI, okay, which you can see in here, just makes the color green, and I'm removing a class if it exists called unhealthy BMI, okay, which is the opposite down here. So if it's not a healthy BMI, then I'm adding a class unhealthy BMI, which is color red, and I'm removing the class healthy BMI. Okay, I want to remove that other class so they're not conflicting. And with all of that, I get this functionality here. Okay, so it reads that, it responds to the form submission, it reads that value, it checks that it's a number, it calls the calculate BMI function, it outputs this bit of text plus the BMI, and then applies a style, a class, depending on whether it's a healthy BMI or an unhealthy BMI. Okay, and that pretty much covers almost everything there is to know about JavaScript. We've done pretty boring examples, but I think it was a good example to technically demonstrate some stuff. So I have also added something which is a bit more interesting down here, which uses the exact same concepts that we've already done, which is just adding an image gallery. Okay, so let's say this is a user profile and they can put up their favorite pictures or something. So I've also got some code down here for an image gallery. I've got an image folder here, which has a bunch of JPEG files in it, which I've just totally ripped from the OS X desktop wallpapers. And I'm storing two variables here, okay? I'm storing an array of the names of the images themselves, and then I'm storing another variable which is the path to the images. I could have stored the path in here as well, but the reason I've done it this way is if I decide to change the name of this folder from IMG to say images, then it's a lot easier to just change it once here than in every single one of these instances. So always when we're coding, we're trying to figure out the ways to make things most flexible and efficient if we want to go back and change things, and also to write the least possible code to do the same thing. Okay, so that's all the information I need to know. Then what I've got here is, okay, so we'll look at the HTML. Here's my image gallery, and it's got, the important thing I'm looking at here is that it's just an image tag, which is empty. It has no source and it has no alt tag. And then I've got a couple of links, okay, which are previous and next buttons. And so what I'm doing is, first of all, I'm selecting the image and I'm I'm calling this attr function, which is a jQuery function which allows me to set the value of any attribute of any element. So I'm setting the source attribute to the image path plus the image name of the first, so the 0 index of this images array. So essentially I'm just setting an image to the first one. And then I'm setting the alt text to just the name of the image as well. And then finally there's a paragraph in there where I'm setting the text of that paragraph also to the name of the image. Okay, so that's what happens by default here. If there was no JavaScript, okay, again, if I get rid of this, sorry, that one. Okay, if there's no JavaScript, there's nothing there. Okay, the image doesn't get populated until the JavaScript actually makes it do so. Then I've got these previous and next buttons, okay, which are obviously, okay, it's a little annoyingly jumping around, but they're obviously, okay, it's obviously just logically stepping through the array, okay, and either replacing that source attribute with the previous or the next image. Okay, so we can see that working here. Okay, so I've got two event handlers, one to handle clicking on the image gallery next link, and I specified those as classes, so hence the dot rather than the hash for the IDs. And the only reason I did that is because I can envisage there may be multiple image galleries on a page, and then this would apply to all of them. Okay, so simply again, I'm keeping an index, and when I click next, I increase it. When I click previous, I decrease it, and then I essentially just have this same code again. I'm applying the source, the alt value, and the paragraph text with the image path, and then the images array, whichever one that image index points to. Now, the only other thing I've got in here is a little conditional statement that says, well, each time I'm adding plus to one, I'm eventually going to run off the end of that array. So if I do that, what I'm doing is if it gets off the end of the array, set image index back to 0 so that it loops back around to the beginning. And in the same way, if I click previous enough times so that index gets less than 0, then set it to be the length of the array -1, so it points to the last one. So that way I can just keep clicking them and they loop around either forwards or backwards. Okay, so it's a little bit more complex, but using the exact same things that we've already looked at. And then the styling is just CSS styling. Okay, there's nothing fancy about that, and I've included a Google Web font as well. Okay, so I'll post this example and I'll let you have a look through the code. And of course, having said that, if I was ever going to do something this complex, I wouldn't code this from scratch anyway. I would go and get one of the hundreds of Jquery image gallery plugins, and then what you would find you would have to do is simply structure your HTML code in a certain way, call one function in that Jquery file, and it would do all this for you, and it'll probably do it with nice animations and nicer styling and all that stuff as well. So I really doubt that you will actually, in implementing any of this stuff, even need to write any JavaScript that complex. Yeah, okay, so we're pretty much out of time there, and that's good. That's everything I wanted to cover. As I said, I've shown you I guess a fairly narrow examples, but I think a good basis for all the fundamentals of it. Obviously, there's going to be some things that I've had to go over quite a lot, quite quickly. So there's going to be some things that are slightly still confusing. As I say here, as I said before, my suggestion is don't, and if with any language, don't ever try and feel like you have to master the whole thing. It's no point, it's a waste of time. Have a look at some of these links. You don't even have to go through to the end of them. Have a look at the first few sections just to reiterate the stuff I've gone over. It will explain some things in more detail. I think with a few hours of looking at these, you'll have enough understanding to be able to read other JavaScript code. And as I said, most of the JavaScript you will use is other people's code, which you simply just need to understand how to call their functions. So I got a few links here. Obviously, being the language of the web as well, okay, there's thousands of examples, millions of examples of how to do pretty much anything under the sun in JavaScript if you just Google for it. So an example here, whoops. Okay, that link's broken. I'll have to fix that. But if this was meant to be a link to, for example, if I want to say how to get the current date in JavaScript. Okay, I search that. heaps of links, okay, and you'll find people post example code. And again, you'll notice that there's multiple different ways of doing the same thing, okay, and so it's about playing around, finding whichever way suits you best. Okay, so just a quick word on these resources. This is a link to a Lynda course on JavaScript Essential Training 2011. I watched the whole thing. It's really good. Really well explained. You probably don't need to go much past halfway, but that's definitely worth a look. This Code Academy link is really interesting. It actually teaches you how to, it's actually meant to teach you how to program generally, but they do it using JavaScript, and it does it interactively. And so you just progress through certain different exercises. Right, and then it gives you other stuff to do. That's also really cool. And then you've got some more general documentation stuff like your W3 schools and your Jquery documentation.